Welcome, my dear friend. Let everything slow. Most of the 20 primarchs landed somewhere that could raise them. Russ fell among wolves and was found by a king. Sanguinius came down on a poisoned moon and was taken in by a tribe. Guilliman landed on Macragge and was adopted by its ruling house. Even the worst cases had somebody. Angron had the gladiators, Lorgar had the priests, Vulcan had a blacksmith and a village. One of them landed on a world where nobody came. Tonight we begin with Nostramo, and with a child who grew up alone in a place with no daylight, seeing things that had not happened yet. A planet in permanent night. Nostramo orbited a dying star, far enough out that the surface received almost no light. People lived there. It was an industrial world producing adamantium, and the extraction had been running long enough that the industry had eaten the planet's atmosphere and its ecology together. Pollution filled the air. What little light the star gave was blocked by the smog above the hive cities. So the population lived in permanent darkness, in vast hives built over the mine workings, working shifts underground and coming up into a night that never ended. There was no government worth the name. Nostramo was run by a criminal oligarchy. The families that controlled the mines controlled everything else, and the arrangement was maintained by violence at every level, from the gangs in the lower hive to the nobles at the top who employed them. Law existed on paper. In practice, a person on Nostramo was safe to the degree that somebody more dangerous had an interest in keeping them alive, and most people had nobody. But that's what that does to a population. Consider what generations of that arrangement produce. Murder was ordinary. So was extortion, kidnapping, and the routine disappearance of anybody who became inconvenient. The strong preyed on the weak because there was no mechanism that punished it, and the weak survived by becoming useful to somebody strong, and the population adapted physically as well as socially. Nostraman eyes evolved for the dark, black, sensitive, unable to tolerate bright light. Nostraman's skin went pale from generations without a sun. The people who would become the 8th Legion were drawn from this, not from a warrior culture, not from a proud tribal tradition, not from a martial world with standards, from hive gangs on a planet where the only functioning social skill was the willingness to hurt somebody first. That fact runs under everything this series will describe. But the pod, a gestation capsule, came down into that darkness, and something walked out of it. He was alone. No tribe found him. No king took him in. No priest, no smith, no gladiator school. The child who would be called Konrad Curze grew up in the underhive of a world that killed children as a matter of routine, and he did it without a single person to explain anything to him. He raised himself. He learned to hunt in the dark, to survive on what he could take, and to avoid the gangs that would have killed him before he was large enough to fight back. And from the beginning, he saw things. The visions Curze. The most important fact about Konrad Curze is that his mind did not work like anybody else's, and it did not work like that by choice. He had prophetic visions, not occasionally, not in dreams, not under ritual conditions, continuously, from childhood, without control and without any way to stop them. What he saw was death, murders still to come, atrocities in progress somewhere else, the end of things, his own, his legions, the Imperiums, and the manner in which each would arrive. The visions came without invitation. They came clearly, and no soul on that planet could have told him what they were. Weigh what that does to a child. Every other psyker in the Imperium who develops that kind of sight is found, assessed, trained, and given some framework for understanding it. Magnus had a world of scholars. The Emperor's own psykers had the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Kurds had a hive city in the dark and no explanation at all. He assumed what any child would assume, that what he saw was true, that it was fixed, and that his role was to act on it. The Night Haunter. Ed so he did. The figure that emerged from the underhive of Nostramo did not announce himself and did not negotiate. He hunted the criminals of that world, one at a time, at night, and what he left behind was arranged for maximum effect. Bodies were displayed rather than hidden or disposed of, hung in public places, in conditions that made the manner of death legible to everybody who saw them. The victims were the gangers, the enforcers, the corrupt officials, and the nobles who ran the whole arrangement. And the population began to change its behavior, not because they had been persuaded, because a person on Nostramo who committed a crime now had a meaningful chance of being found by something that could not be fought, bargained with, or escaped from, and everybody in that hive knew somebody it had happened to. They called him the Night Haunter. Whether he chose the name or the population gave it to him is unclear and hardly matters. What matters is that it worked. What Nostramo became. Within a few years, Nostramo was the most orderly world in its region. Crime rates collapsed. The oligarchy stopped operating openly. Mining production rose because the extortion and the sabotage and the gang wars that had been eating into it stopped. Nostraman citizens went about their business in the dark without expecting to be robbed or killed. The Night Haunter had achieved, through terror alone, what no government on that planet had managed in centuries. And there is a version of this story where that is the whole of it, and Konrad Curze is a grim figure who fixed a broken world by unpleasant means and can be judged accordingly. That version is available, and this account does not endorse it, for reasons that arrive in a moment. What it cost him. The Night Haunter's own condition during this period is worth stating, because the setting gives it, and it is easy to skip. He was not enjoying himself. The visions did not stop. He continued to see murders before they happened, which meant that every night he had a list, and every night he could only reach some of them. The people he did not reach in time died, and he saw those too. He slept badly and rarely. He ate irregularly. He spoke to almost nobody, because there was nobody on Nostramo who could have followed a conversation with him, and because his whole method depended on being a figure rather than a person, and the work never finished. Crime dropped and did not disappear, and the ones he took were replaced, and the visions kept arriving. He was a child, alone, in the dark, doing a job with no end, on the basis of information nobody had explained to him. The one that mattered, and somewhere in all of it, he saw his own death. That vision is the center of this entire series, and it needs stating with precision, because everything Curze does afterward runs off it. He saw an assassin. He saw the circumstances. He saw where it would happen and by whose hand and what it would mean. and the vision came to him early and never went away, which put him in a position no other primarch occupied. Angron did not know how he would end. Horus did not know. Sanguinius foresaw his death, as this channel described in another series, and that knowledge shaped his entire life. Curze knew too, and the difference is what he concluded from it. Sanguinius saw his death and walked toward it to spare others. Curze saw his and concluded that if the future was fixed, then nothing he did was chosen, and if nothing was chosen, then nobody could be blamed for anything, including him. That is the reasoning of a child working alone from bad premises, with no one to argue with him, and he carried it into everything he did for the rest of his life. The fleet in the sky. Then the Imperium arrived. The Emperor came to Nostramo during the Great Crusade and found his 8th son ruling a world by terror. The reunion is one of the least warm of the 20. Curze was given the 8th Legion, which was already in the field and already had a reputation for the harsher end of compliance work. He remade it in Nostramo's image, took recruits from that world's hive gangs, and the Legion became the Night Lords. The Emperor's reasoning has never been set out anywhere. He had a son who ruled through fear on a world where it had worked, and he gave that son a legion and a mandate to bring worlds into compliance. What happened next was that Curze did what he had been doing on Nostramo, at a scale of hundreds of worlds, and it worked, and the Imperium took the results and asked no questions for a considerable time. What nobody did for him. We close on the omission that this whole series turns on. Nobody taught him. Curze arrived in the Imperium with an untrained psychic gift that produced continuous visions of death, a moral framework he had assembled alone as a child in a hive, and a method built entirely on terror, because terror was the only tool that had ever produced results for him. The Emperor had access to every psychic authority in the Imperium. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica existed, Magnus was available, and Magnus of all people understood what an untrained seer suffers. None of that reached Konrad Curze. He was given a legion and a task and sent out, and the visions continued for the whole of his life, without anyone ever helping him understand what he was looking at. Whether that was oversight, indifference, or a decision, this account cannot say. What can be said is that the primarch who ended his life, believing that everything had been arranged in advance, had, in one respect, a case. Fav, the legion before him. The 8th Legion existed before Nostramo, and what it was already doing matters. They were Terran-raised, and their function in the early crusade was the harshest end of compliance work. Where other legions were sent to conquer and integrate, the 8th was used against targets that required breaking rather than persuading. Their reputation for that predates Curze entirely. The legion was already the instrument you deployed when a world needed to be shown what refusal costs. Then their primarch arrived, and what he found was a formation already doing a version of what he had done on Nostramo, at a larger scale, with the Imperium's blessing. He did not have to teach them terror. He had to teach them method, and the method he brought was the one he had built alone in a hive. Displays, arrangements, and the deliberate construction of an event that would be described accurately by everybody who survived it. Which is why the Night Lords work as well as they do. The Legion was suited to him before he got there. and the recruitment from Nostramo afterward turned a tendency into a culture. Mac, the recruitment that poisoned everything. One decision made during this period ruined the Legion, and Curze made it himself. He took recruits from Nostramo. That is standard practice. Every primarch recruited from his own world, and the resulting legions took their character from the population that supplied them. The problem is what Nostramo supplied. Not warriors from a martial tradition, not disciplined youths from an ordered society. Gangers, murderers, and hive predators from a planet whose only functioning skill was violence, applied first. While Curze was present, this worked. The Legion had a primarch who terrified it into holding a line, and the men in it observed a code because the alternative was his personal attention. The code was thin, and it was held in place by one person. Take that person away, and what remains is a Space Marine Legion recruited from a criminal underclass, with power armor, a mandate to use terror, and nobody left who frightens them. That is the Night Lords after the Heresy, and this account will get there, like how the terror worked. Before we leave the founding, the method deserves description, because it was more sophisticated than its reputation suggests. Brutality alone was never the point of it. Anybody can brutalize. What Curze built was a system for producing surrender without fighting, and it ran on information as much as on violence. A world scheduled for compliance would receive the Legion's attention before the Legion arrived. Communications interfered with. Isolated installations found destroyed in a manner designed to be reported. Individual figures of local importance removed in circumstances the population would talk about. By the time the fleet appeared, the target had already spent weeks constructing the Night Lords in its own imagination, and the imagined version was worse than any assault could have been. Then surrender was offered, and most worlds took it. The Imperium got compliance at a fraction of the cost of a conventional campaign, and the Night Lords moved on, and the worlds behind them stayed compliant for a very long time, because nobody wanted a second visit. Consider that from a Crusade planner's perspective. The 8th Legion delivered results, quickly, cheaply, with minimal Imperial casualties. For a considerable period, nobody in the Imperium had any incentive to examine the method closely. What he believed he was doing. And we close on Curze's own position, because it is coherent, and this account should represent it fairly. His argument ran like this: humanity is fallible. People do terrible things whenever they judge they can get away with them, and no appeal to virtue has ever changed that. What changes behavior is the certainty of consequence. He had tested this. Nostramo was the experiment, a world beyond the reach of any moral appeal, brought to order in a few years by a single sufficiently frightening figure. So the Imperium's talk of enlightenment and unity struck him as either dishonest or naive. The Emperor conquered by force and called it something else. The other primarchs killed on a scale Curze never approached and were praised for it, because they did it in daylight with better rhetoric. The Night Lords told the truth about what compliance was. Everybody else dressed it up. That case has holes, and this series will find them. What it does not have is stupidity, and the popular version of Konrad Curze as a raving sadist misses that he had thought about it, arrived at a position, and applied it consistently. The problem was never that he had no argument. The problem was where the argument went once he stopped being able to see anything except the ending. Sleep well. Tomorrow the Great Crusade begins, and the Imperium finds out what it has hired. The 8th Legion was good at its work. That is the fact this part turns on, and it is the reason the Imperium tolerated what it tolerated for as long as it did. Worlds fell to the Night Lords faster than they fell to anyone. Casualties among Imperial forces were low. Compliance, once achieved, held. Tonight we follow the crusade, from the point where the arrangement was working to the point where the Imperium could no longer pretend it did not know. The ledger. Begin with what the Night Lords delivered, because the case for them was real. A conventional compliance action required a fleet, a landing, a ground campaign, and an occupation. It cost time, materiel, and Astartes' lives, and the crusade was operating on a schedule that could not absorb many long sieges. The Night Lords bypassed most of that. Worlds surrendered before the fighting started, or after a demonstration rather than a campaign. The Legion moved on quickly. Imperial casualties were minimal, and the compliance was durable. A world that had received the 8th Legion's attention did not rebel afterward, because the population had a shared memory of what the Imperium's displeasure looked like, and no appetite for a second demonstration. By every metric the Crusade's planners used, the 8th Legion was performing above expectation. What was not in the ledger, what Otam, and now what those metrics did not capture. The demonstrations escalated. What had been targeted removals on Nostramo became, at Legion scale, mass executions arranged for effect. Defeat was the least of what happened to populations. They were processed, and the processing was designed to be witnessed and reported. The methods included practices that Imperial records describe in language deliberately vague: flaying, public display of the dead on a scale requiring engineering, the systematic destruction of a world's leadership in ways calculated to be discussed for generations. And the Legion enjoyed it. That is the part that separates the Night Lords from their primarch. Curze had a doctrine. The men he recruited from Nostramo's hives had a license, and the distinction between applying terror as policy and applying it because you like it stopped being visible somewhere in the middle of the crusade. Curze losing control. The Primarch's own condition worsened across this period, and the accounts are consistent about the direction. The visions did not stop. They intensified. Curze was seeing the heresy before it happened. Brother against brother, the Imperium at war with itself, the Emperor's project failing, and his own end arriving in the manner he had known about since childhood. He slept less. He withdrew from his own officers. He suffered episodes his Legion learned to recognize and stay away from, and the man who emerged from them was less coherent each time. And he began to say things. He told Fulgrim, in confidence, what he had seen, that the Emperor would kill him, and that the legions were being built for a purpose nobody had disclosed to them. Fulgrim reported it. The betrayal of confidence. That moment deserves its own attention, because it is the point where Curze stops being manageable. He had confided in a brother. Whatever else Curze was, the act of telling Fulgrim was an attempt at connection. A man who had never had anyone to explain his visions to, telling another Primarch what he was carrying. Fulgrim took it to Rogel Dawn. Dawn confronted Curze about it, and the confrontation went the way confrontations with Konrad Curze went. Curze attacked him. He wounded Dawn badly and killed several Imperial fists guarding him, and then he took his fleet and left. Consider what that sequence establishes. The one time Curze reached out, the disclosure was passed on without his consent to a primarch, who then challenged him with it. His response was violence, which confirmed everything Dawn suspected, which confirmed everything Curze believed about how this would go. Every party behaved according to their nature, and the outcome was worse than any of them wanted. Nostramo Nov. Where he took the fleet is the single worst thing Konrad Curze did, and it was done to his own people. Nostramo had gone bad again. The order the Night Haunter established did not survive his departure. Once the Legion began taking recruits, and the Primarch was permanently off-world, the criminal oligarchy reasserted itself, and within a generation, Nostramo was what it had been before, a lawless hive world run by gangs, producing the very kind of recruit that had been poisoning his legion. Curze arrived in orbit and ordered his fleet to open fire. This was no strike against the leadership, and no punitive raid on the hives. The Legion's lance batteries were directed into the planet itself, into the wound left by his own arrival decades earlier, and Nostramo was shattered. Billions died. The world broke apart. The 8th Legion's homeworld and recruiting base ceased to exist on the order of the man who had spent his childhood trying to save it. So, why he did it? The reasoning available to us is bleak, and it is consistent with everything else about him. Nostramo had proved his own point against him. He had fixed that world through terror, and the fix had lasted precisely as long as the terror was present, and the moment he left it reverted, which meant either that his method did not work, or that Nostramo was beyond saving. He chose the second, and acted on it, and in doing so, destroyed the evidence that would have settled the question. There is also a colder reading. The Legion was being poisoned by Nostraman recruits, and the recruits came from Nostramo, and removing the source removed the problem. Under that reading, the destruction of a world and its billions was a personnel decision. Both readings are available. The Legion took the second and never forgave him for it. Post or what? What it did to his sons. The Night Lord's relationship with their Primarch was never warm, and after Nostramo, it was something else. Curze was the only Primarch who showed almost no affection for his Legion. He did not build the bonds other Primarchs built with their sons. He did not praise, did not confide, and did not defend them when the Imperium's complaints arrived. And then he destroyed their world. Not a world they loved. Nostramo was a terrible place, and the men who came from it had no illusions about it. But it was theirs, and it was where their families were, and the Primarch who killed it had not consulted anybody. From that point the Legion followed him out of fear rather than loyalty. That distinction carries the whole weight of what happens after his death, and this account will return to it. From Sheraut. Then the Emperor recalled him. The complaints had accumulated from other Primarchs, from Imperial commanders, from the governors of worlds that had been brought into compliance by methods nobody could file a report about. Curze was summoned to answer. He went. That fact is easy to miss and worth holding. Konrad Curze, having destroyed his own homeworld and having been told the Emperor would kill him, obeyed the summons and presented himself for judgment. Then he changed his mind. At Sheraut, he struck Rogel Dawn, rejected the authority of the judgment he had come to receive, and took the 8th Legion rogue before the heresy had even begun, which puts the Night Lords in a category of one. They were in open defiance of the Imperium before Horus turned, for reasons that had nothing to do with chaos, and when the heresy arrived, they joined it as an army already outside the law. Shua, what the Imperium had bought. We close on the arrangement that produced all of this, because the responsibility is not entirely Curze's. The Imperium found a primarch who ruled by terror on a world where terror had worked. It gave him a legion already suited to that method, a mandate to bring hundreds of worlds into compliance, and no supervision worth the name. It then accepted the results for decades without asking how they were achieved, because the results were excellent and the alternative was slower. By the time the complaints reached a level that required action, the Legion had spent a generation being rewarded for the behavior the Imperium now wanted to punish, and the Primarch had spent that same period being told by his own visions that this was how it would end. The Imperium hired an instrument, used it hard, and was surprised by what it had become. The Legion's own culture, something developed inside the 8th Legion during the Crusade that the Imperium never inspected, and it explains their later behavior better than any doctrine. They became a criminal organization with power armor. The Nostraman recruits brought hive gang structure with them, crews, territories, reputations, and the constant low-level competition of men who measure each other by what they are prepared to do. The Legion's formal command structure sat on top of that and never replaced it. Companies became warbands with their own character. Officers held position by a combination of rank and personal standing, and the standing mattered more. Disputes were settled in ways the Codex would not recognize, and a set of practices spread that the Imperium would have called mutilation, and the Legion called ornament. Skulls and skin taken from significant kills, trophies worn openly, armor marked with a personal record of what its wearer had done. None of this was Curze's design. He built a doctrine of terror as policy. What his sons built underneath it was a culture that enjoyed the work, and by the middle of the Crusade, the two were no longer distinguishable from outside. The brothers who objected, the complaints that reached the Emperor in the end came from named sources, and the names matter. Rogel Dawn regarded the Night Lord's methods as a corruption of what the legions were for, and said so, repeatedly and in the terms one would expect from him. Gilliman objected on grounds of policy. A compliance achieved by terror produces a population that obeys, while frightened and revolts the moment the fear lifts. And the Ultramarines' whole approach was built on the opposite principle. Fulgrim's objection is harder to categorize, given what he later became. What is recorded is that he was told something in confidence and passed it on. And Vulcan objected on the only grounds Curze could not dismiss, that the people being terrorized were the people the Imperium existed to protect, and that a method which treated them as material was a method that had lost the point of the exercise. Curze's answer to all of it was consistent. They killed as many as he did. The difference was that they told themselves a story about it. Vulcan. The antagonism between those two produced the strangest episode of Curze's life, and it belongs here. They hated each other, and the hatred was mutual and personal in a way that Curze's other rivalries were not. Vulcan represented everything Curze considered dishonest about the Imperium, the belief that people are worth protecting, expressed by a primarch who killed as freely as any of them. At Istvan, Curze captured him. What followed ran for a long time, and it is described in the setting with a bluntness that stands out even against the Heresy's general tone. Curze killed Vulcan repeatedly in a variety of ways, and Vulcan came back each time, because whatever Vulcan is, ordinary death does not hold him. The purpose was not information, and it was not military. Curze was conducting an argument. He was attempting to break a primarch who believed in something, in order to demonstrate that the belief was a decoration people wear until circumstances remove it. Vulcan did not break. That failure sits underneath everything Curze does afterward, and he never acknowledged it. The one experiment he ran to prove his central thesis returned the opposite result, and he carried on as though it had not. And what the Heresy offered him? We close on the question of why the Night Lords joined Horus, because the usual answer is wrong. Power had nothing to do with it. Curze took no interest in ruling anything and said so. They did not join for chaos. The Night Lords are the least religious of the traitor legions by a wide margin, and Curze's contempt for the ruinous powers is on record. His legion took chaos gifts later, individually, out of pragmatism rather than devotion. They joined because they were already outside. Cheraut had happened. The legion had gone rogue before Horus declared, for its own reasons, and the Heresy arrived as a war in which the Imperium was going to be fighting them regardless. And there is a reading the setting supports and does not confirm. Curze had seen the Heresy coming since childhood. He knew which side he would be on, because he had watched it. Joining Horus was not a decision, so much as arriving at a place he had been looking at for 100 years. If that reading is right, then the 8th Legion turned traitor because their Primarch's visions told him he already had, which is the most Konrad Curze sequence available. Sleep well. Tomorrow the Heresy begins, and the Night Lords find out that being a traitor changes very little about their day. For most of the traitor legions, the Heresy was a transformation. The word-bearers became something they had been building toward in secret. The World-Eaters were unleashed. The Emperor's children discovered what they were prepared to become. Each of them crossed a line and was different afterward. The Night Lords crossed no line because they had already been standing on the other side of it since Cheraut. Tonight we follow them through a war that changed almost nothing about how they operated, and we look at what a legion does when treachery is a matter of paperwork. Istvan Sif. The drop site massacre was the Heresy's opening atrocity, and the Night Lords were part of it. 7 legions were ordered to Istvan 5 to bring Horus to account. 4 of them were already his. The Iron Hands, Salamanders and Raven Guard landed first, engaged the traitors, and were then fired on from behind by the legions they believed were reinforcing them. The Night Lords held the left flank of that second wave, alongside the Iron Warriors, the Word-Bearers, and the Alpha Legion. They cut down loyalist Astartes who had turned their backs to them. 3 legions were broken there: the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, and the Iron Hands never recovered their pre-Heresy strength, and the Imperium's ability to bring Horus to battle was destroyed in an afternoon. And Curze took Vulcan prisoner, which this account described last night, for what they did in the war. The Night Lord's role across the rest of the Heresy is worth stating because it is unlike the other traitor legions. They did very little that resembles a campaign. The sons of Horus fought for objectives. The Iron Warriors conducted sieges. The Death Guard and the World Eaters were used as weapons pointed at things that needed destroying. The Night Lords went raiding. They struck Imperial worlds behind the lines, in the rear areas, at targets of no strategic value, and they did it in the manner they had developed during the Crusade. Arrive, terrorize, extract what could be taken, and leave. Horus found this less useful than he had hoped. A legion that will not hold a position and cannot be relied upon to arrive where it is sent is a difficult instrument to plan around, and the War Master's staff came to treat the 8th as a resource to be pointed rather than a formation to be integrated. Thrammer's Crusade. The one major campaign they did fight is the one this channel described from the other side. The Thrammer's Crusade pitted the Night Lords against the Dark Angels in the eastern reaches, and it ran for years. Curze against the Lion, in a theatre far from anywhere the war was being decided. The details belong to the Dark Angels series, and we will not repeat them. What belongs here is the outcome and its meaning. The Lion took him prisoner. Konrad Curze, primarch of the 8th Legion, was captured by his brother and held, and the Dark Angels transported him with the intention of delivering him to justice. He escaped, but he had been taken, and the taking is worth registering, because it is the second time in this account that Curze submitted to a process he could have avoided. Why he kept surrendering. Twice now, Curze has allowed himself to be brought to judgment. He answered the Emperor's summons after Nostramo. He was taken by the Lion at Thramas, and there is a third occasion coming that this series will spend its final night on. The pattern is worth stating plainly because it contradicts the popular version of him. A primarch who wanted only to inflict terror and escape consequence does not present himself for trial. Curze did, more than once, and the reason he gives when asked is consistent. He wanted the judgment. Not acquittal, judgment. He wanted the Imperium to look at what he had done, on its own terms, and rule on it, because he believed the ruling would expose the Imperium rather than him. Every time, the process broke down before it reached a verdict, and every time, Curze read the breakdown as confirmation. They will not judge me honestly, because an honest judgment would convict them. Curze, Imperium Secundus. Then comes the strangest episode of the Heresy, and Curze is at the center of it. Cut off from terror by the ruin storm, 3 primarchs founded a second Imperium in the 500 worlds. Guilliman as its architect, Sanguinius as its emperor, and the Lion as its Lord Protector. Curze got into it. He infiltrated Macragge, reached the throne room, wounded Askelon of the Sanguinary Guard, and took him hostage. And then he spoke to Sanguinius. And what he said was the substance of his entire position. He told the angel that he had seen his death, not as a threat, as one seer to another, because Sanguinius carried the same burden, and Curze knew it. He described what would happen aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and he was correct. Then he told him the rest. What he believed the Emperor had done. The theory Curze put to Sanguinius that night is the most coherent thing he ever said, and it has never been refuted. He argued that all of it had been arranged. The scattering of the primarchs, his own life on Nostramo, the heresy, Sanguinius's death, Curze's own end at the hands of an imperial assassin. All of it, according to Curze, was part of a design the emperor had made and disclosed to nobody. Under that reading, none of the primarchs chose anything. Horus did not choose to fall. Curze did not choose to become the Night Haunter. They were placed, shaped, and used, and the outcomes were known to the man who placed them. Which means that Curze's crimes are not crimes, because a tool is not culpable for what it was made to do. Sanguinius did not accept the argument. He also did not have an answer to it, and nothing in the setting since has produced one. Where the argument fails. This account should say where the argument fails, because it does fail, and the failure is instructive. Foreknowledge does not establish design. The emperor may have known a great deal about what was coming without having arranged any of it, and knowing an outcome is not the same as causing it. And Curze's own conduct undercuts him. He destroyed Nostramo on a decision he made in orbit, in anger, after learning something he had not foreseen. He confided in Fulgrim, which was a choice. He surrendered to judgment 3 times, which is behavior nobody would exhibit if they believed their actions were fixed. A man with no belief in his own agency would not keep behaving as though the verdict mattered. But the argument has a core that survives all of that. Nobody taught him. The Imperium found a child who saw the future, gave him no framework for understanding it, put a legion in his hands, and used the results for decades. Curze's conclusion was wrong. His grievance was not. Lux. The Night Lords were at the siege, and their contribution was characteristic. They did not lead assaults. They were not given a wall to break or a gate to hold. What they did was operate in the spaces the fighting created, striking at civilian populations within the palace's outer zones, at the refugee districts, at targets whose destruction had no military value and enormous psychological effect. That was the assignment they were suited to, and they carried it out. And when Horus died, and the traitor cause collapsed, the Night Lords did what the Night Lords do. They withdrew, fast, before the encirclement closed, and they were among the first traitor formations to get clear of the solar system. Where they went, we close on the aftermath, because the Legion's choice of destination says a great deal about it. Most of the traitor legions ran for the Eye of Terror. It was the only refuge available, and it offered the protection of the powers they had bargained with. The Night Lords went east. They established themselves on the eastern fringe, on a world Curze chose and named Tsagualsa, and there they built a fortress and a palace, and the palace was constructed from materials this account will describe tomorrow, which puts them outside the Eye and outside the Imperium at once. A legion that had joined the Heresy without joining Chaos, that had gone rogue before the war and stayed rogue after it, took itself to the far edge of the galaxy to be somewhere nobody governed, and their primarch, who had known how this would end since he was a child in the dark, began waiting for the last part of the vision to arrive. The Legion coming apart. Something was working its way through the Legion, across those war years that nobody outside could see, and it mattered more than any battle they fought. The Legion was dividing. One faction held to Curze's original doctrine, terror as an instrument, applied to a purpose, with the purpose being the point. These were the officers who still believed the Night Lords were doing something rather than merely doing damage. Another had abandoned the doctrine and kept the practice. For them, the terror was the purpose, and the Legion's function was to be free to do what Nostramo's hives had trained them for, without the Imperium's inconvenient interest. And Curze did nothing to settle it. He had stopped commanding in any meaningful sense. His episodes came more often. He spent long periods apart from his Legion, and when he was present, his instructions read more and more like the pronouncements of a man arguing with something only he could see. A Legion with a doctrinal split and an absent commander does not stay a Legion. It becomes a collection of formations that share a paint scheme, and by the time Terra fell, the Night Lords were most of the way there. Vu, Sevatar. One figure held it together for as long as anyone could, and he deserves his own section. Jago Sevatarian, called Sevatar, was first captain of the 8th Legion and commander of the Atramentar, and by every account, he was the only person alive who could speak to Konrad Curze as an equal and survive it. He was also a psyker in a Legion and an era where that was dangerous to admit. What makes Sevatar remarkable is that he saw his primarch clearly, in full, and stayed anyway. He knew Curze was deteriorating. He knew the Legion was rotting. He said so, to Curze's face, in language that would have killed anybody else. And he ran the Legion in the gaps. When Curze was absent or incoherent, Sevatar issued the orders, held the formations together, and kept the 8th functioning as a military instrument rather than a mob. He was captured during the Thramma's crusade, and his subsequent fate is left deliberately unclear by the setting. What is clear is the shape of the loss. The Night Lord's one stabilizing figure was removed from them at the exact point where they needed him most, and after him there was nobody. Lock, the Atramentar, a word about the Legion's elite, because they show what the 8th could do when it was pointed properly. The Atramentar were Terminator armored veterans, the first captain's own formation, and they were among the most effective heavy assault units in the crusade. Nothing about them was theatrical. They fought as a disciplined shock force, and they were extremely good at it. That is the part the Legion's reputation buries. Terrorists in Ceramite covers only part of what they were. They contained formations that could stand against anybody's elite and win, and their record in open engagement is better than their public image suggests. Which sharpens the tragedy of what happened to them. This was a capable Legion, led by a primarch with a coherent doctrine, that fell apart because the doctrine was built on a foundation nobody had ever examined, and the primarch stopped being able to hold anything together. What the heresy cost them? We close on the accounting, because the Night Lords came out of that war worse off than almost anybody. They gained nothing. No territory, no elevation, no daemon primarch, no gifts from the powers. Curze took no patron, and the Legion took no reward. They lost their homeworld before the war even started, on their own primarch's order. They lost Sevatar, and with him, the only person who could translate between the primarch and the Legion. They lost cohesion. What went east after Terra was not a Legion in any organized sense. It was warbands traveling in the same direction under a primarch who had stopped commanding them, and they lost the argument. Curze had spent his life insisting that Terra was the honest instrument, and that everybody else was lying about their methods. The Heresy gave him a galaxy-wide field test, and what it demonstrated was that a force built on fear cannot hold anything once the fear stops being useful. He had proved it on Nostramo already, and refused to read the result. The Heresy handed him the same finding at a larger scale, and by then he was past reading anything. Sleep well. Tomorrow we go to the carrion world, and to the assassin who was allowed to walk in. There is one recorded instance in the history of the Imperium of a mortal killing a primarch. Not a daemon, not another primarch, not a weapon of the Dark Age or a working of the warp. A human being, sent by an office on Terra, who walked into a fortress and did the thing she had been sent to do. Tonight we look at how that was possible, and at the man who made it possible on purpose. The carrion world. After Terra, the 8th Legion went east and settled on a world Curze chose. Sagualsa sits on the outer reaches of the eastern fringe, and what the Legion built there was a base of operations from which to raid Imperial space for as long as the raiding lasted. Curze built something else. The accounts describe a palace, constructed on his own instruction, and the material used in its construction is the detail that gives the world its name. The structure was raised from bodies. Living ones, according to the record, worked into the architecture and kept in that condition. That is the last thing Konrad Curze made, and it is worth setting beside the boy from the first night of this account. A child alone in a hive, who hunted murderers because he could see their crimes before they happened, ended his life in a building made of people. Whatever the visions did to him across those centuries, that is where it arrived. Tipu, what he had become. His condition on Sagualsa is described consistently, and it is not command. He was rarely coherent. He spent long periods alone. The legion around him operated as warbands under their own captains, and Curze's involvement in their activities was intermittent and unpredictable. He had also stopped pretending the visions were survivable. What he saw had been narrowing for years toward a single point, and the point was the ending that had been in front of him since the Underhive, and on Sagualsa, it was close enough to be the only thing left in front of him. The Legion knew, his officers knew, and nobody did anything about it, because what bound this Legion to its primarch stopped being loyalty when he shattered their world, as our second night set out, and a formation held together by fear does not intervene when the frightening thing starts to fail. The order from Terra, the Imperium wanted him dead. The reasoning was straightforward. Curze was a traitor primarch, operating from a known location, conducting raids into Imperial space, and unlike the legions in the Eye of Terror, he was reachable. So the Officio Assassinorum was tasked. The accounts describe a substantial commitment, a significant portion of the Calidus Temple, directed at one target, which indicates how seriously the Imperium took the difficulty of killing a primarch. One of them got through. Her name was Meshen. How she reached him. The details of her infiltration are less interesting than what she found when she got there, and the setting is direct about it. She encountered no guards. A Calidus assassin, reaching the throne room of a primarch, inside his own fortress, on a world held by his legion, should have been the hardest infiltration in the galaxy. The Atramentar existed. The legion's warbands were on that planet. Sagualsa was a fortress world. The path was clear the whole way, which establishes the fact this part exists to state. Konrad Curze was not caught unaware. He knew she was coming. He knew when she would arrive, and he had removed everything that stood between her and his throne. What he said to her, she reached him, and he spoke to her, and what he said is preserved. He told her that her presence did not surprise him. He had known about her, he said, since her craft entered the eastern fringe, and he asked her the question that she had presumably been asking herself for the length of the corridor. Why had he not had her killed? The answer he gave is the whole of his life compressed into a sentence, and this account will paraphrase rather than reproduce it under the limits this channel observes. He told her that the Emperor's servants had come to kill him, and that death was nothing when set against vindication. Then he let her do it. So, what he meant. The argument in that sentence deserves unpacking, because it is the last move in a case Curze had been building since he was a child. His whole position had held that the Imperium's language about justice was a costume worn over ordinary violence. That conquest by force had been renamed enlightenment, that the difference between the Night Lords and the other legions was honesty rather than method. The Imperium's response to a primarch who defied it was to send an assassin. Not a tribunal, not a summons, though he had answered 2 of those already, as our third night described. Not a brother sent to bring him in. A killer, dispatched in secret, to end him without a hearing. Which was, to Curze, the proof. If the Imperium were what it claimed, it would have judged him. It sent a murderer instead, and by his reckoning, that settled the question of which of them had been telling the truth about what the Imperium was. So he dismissed his guards and made sure the murder happened, because a murder proved his point, and a trial might not have, that whether he was right. This account should engage with the argument rather than admiring it, because it has a whole, and the whole matters. The Imperium had tried to judge him, twice. He was summoned to terror, and he came, and then he attacked Rogel Dawn, and left before the process could conclude. He was captured by the Lion and escaped. The tribunal Curze wanted was available on both occasions, and he removed himself from it both times, which makes the assassin the instrument left after the others had failed, rather than the Imperium's first resort, and they had failed partly because Curze would not sit still for them. And yet the core of the grievance survives even that. The Imperium did send an assassin. It did decide, at some point, that a hearing was not worth the trouble, and the man who received that decision had spent his life predicting it. Curze arranged his own death to prove something that was already true, and that he had also helped make true. What the Legion did with it. The aftermath is the strangest part, and it belongs to the Legion rather than to him. Mishen was allowed to escape, that is on the record. The Legion did not close the trap after the killing, and she got off Tsagualsa alive. Some readings hold that this was Curze's arrangement too, part of the same design. Others hold that the Legion was too shocked or too disorganized to react. She was hunted afterward for a very long time by Night Lords who had not accepted the arrangement, and the accounts of her end are unpleasant. And the Legion's other pursuit was for the recording. Mishen carried a picked log of the assassination. The Night Lords spent 10,000 years trying to recover it, and when a copy was found, it was disseminated through the whole Legion. Consider what that means. 10 millennia after his death, the 8th Legion's warbands laid eyes on their primarch at last, most of them for the first time, and what they saw was the recording of him being killed. That is the only image of Konrad Curze most Night Lords have ever had. Not a leader at the head of his legion, a man on a throne in the dark, saying a sentence about vindication and dying. What broke less? We close on the immediate consequence, because it was total. The legion had been held together by fear of one person. That person was dead. There was no succession. Curze named no heir and gave no instructions. Sevatar was gone. The Atramentar had no primarch to serve. Within a very short period, the 8th Legion ceased to exist as a legion. It broke into competing warbands, each under its own captain, each pursuing its own interests, and those warbands scattered into the eye of terror and across the eastern fringe. They have never reunified. 10,000 years later, the Night Lords are still what they became that day, a name shared by a large number of separate groups who fight each other about as often as they fight anybody else. The primarch who believed nothing was chosen made one choice at the end, and it dissolved his legion. Why a primarch is hard to kill. Something about the assassination deserves stating, because the difficulty of the task explains how deliberate the arrangement was. A primarch is not a large space marine. The gap between an Astartes and a primarch is wider than the gap between a human and an Astartes. Reaction speed, physical strength, resilience to injury, and a perceptual awareness that makes ambush close to impossible. Curze in particular was among the deadliest of the 20 in personal combat. He fought Dawn and wounded him. He fought Vulcan repeatedly. The Lion needed a long campaign and a hard fight to bring him in. A Calidus assassin, however skilled, is a human being with equipment. Under any ordinary circumstance, the encounter on Saguelsa ends in about a second, with the assassin dead and the primarch mildly interested. The only way it goes the other way is if the target permits it, and this is why the setting treats M'Shen's kill as the singular event it is. She did not defeat a primarch, she was given one. Hawk. What the Imperium got out of it. The Imperium side of the ledger is worth checking, because the operation succeeded and achieved less than it should have. A traitor primarch was removed. That is a real result, and there are only a handful of comparable ones in the setting. And what followed was worse for the Imperium in some respects than what came before. A single legion under one commander is a target. It has a location, a leadership, a doctrine, and a pattern of behavior, and those things can be studied, anticipated, and in time engaged. What replaced it was dozens of independent warbands with no fixed base, no shared command, and no predictable pattern at all. Killing Curze converted a containable problem into a diffuse one, and the Imperium has been dealing with the diffuse version for 10,000 years. The Officio Assassinorum completed its assignment. Whether the assignment was correct is a question the Imperium's own institutions do not ask about themselves. Hivyo, the reading nobody likes. There is an interpretation of the death that the setting permits and most accounts avoid, and it deserves a hearing. Curze may have been wrong about what he was proving. His argument required the Imperium to be a hypocrite, an institution that speaks of justice and delivers murder, and he arranged the murder to demonstrate it. But an institution that sends an assassin to a traitor who has twice escaped judgment, who is actively raiding its worlds, and who commands a legion beyond reach of any fleet, is not necessarily behaving hypocritically. It may be behaving practically. Under that reading, the Imperium did not prove Curze's point. It made a resource decision about a hostile target, and Curze read a grand philosophical confirmation into an administrative act, which would mean he staged the whole scene to settle a dispute the other party had never entered. Nothing settles this. What can be observed is that Curze needed the Imperium to be making a statement, and institutions of that size rarely are. What he left his sons. We close on the inheritance, because it explains everything in tomorrow's account. He gave them no doctrine they could carry forward. The terror had been his method, justified by his reasoning, and he never built a structure that would survive him holding it. He gave them no successor and no instructions. He gave them a home world he had destroyed himself, which meant no recruiting base and no place to return to. And he gave them a recording of his own death, in the end, as the only image of him most of them would ever have. Weigh what a Night Lord of the 41st millennium receives. A legion name with no legion attached, a method with no purpose behind it, a father who despised his sons, destroyed their world, and then arranged his own killing without telling any of them. They kept the method anyway. That is what the rest of this series is about, and it is the bleakest thing in it. 10,000 years of men doing what Konrad Curze taught them, for reasons he took with him. Sleep well. Tomorrow we look at what those warbands became. Every traitor legion came apart to some degree after the Heresy. The World Eaters fragmented into warbands. The Emperor's children scattered. Even the sons of Horus, who had the War Master's own authority behind them, broke and were reduced. The Night Lords came apart further and faster than any of them, and what they became has no equivalent among the others. Tonight we look at the legion that stopped being a legion, why they fell apart. The immediate cause was the death described last night, but the conditions had been building for a century. When a body of men coheres only because one figure frightens them, nothing sits underneath that fear. Remove the individual, and there is nothing to hold. The Night Lords had no religious framework, unlike the word-bearers, whose faith gave them a reason to stay together. They had no shared appetite that required organization, unlike the Emperor's children. They had no siege doctrine or engineering tradition, unlike the Iron Warriors, whose expertise gives them a purpose that outlasts any commander. What they had was a method and a man, and the man was gone. They also had a homeworld problem. Every other traitor legion could recruit from the Eye of Terror, or from conquered populations, or from worlds they held. The Night Lords had destroyed Nostramo themselves, and no equivalent source existed. So they began the long decline that continues to this day. No reinforcement, no replacement, and every casualty permanent. How they live now. The Night Lords of the 41st millennium are pirates. That word is precise rather than dismissive. They operate in warbands of varying size, each under its own commander, from ships that are their only permanent territory. They raid Imperial space for supplies, for slaves, for ammunition, and for the wreckage of ships they cannot replace. They do not hold worlds. They do not attempt to. A warband, takes what it needs from a target and leaves, and the target is usually chosen for what can be extracted rather than for any strategic value, and they fight each other, frequently. Warbands compete for resources, for recruits, and for the salvage of other warbands, and a Night Lord's vessel encountering another Night Lord's vessel is an uncertain event for both. And round. The equipment problem. One practical consequence of all this deserves stating because it shapes their behavior more than any doctrine. They are running out of everything. Power armor cannot be manufactured by a warband. Neither can bolt weapons, gene seed, ammunition, or the components that keep a warship functioning. The Night Lords have been consuming a finite stock of Heresy-era equipment for 10,000 years, with no way to replenish it. What they have instead is scavenging. Armor is repaired with parts taken from other suits, including their own dead. Ships are maintained by cannibalizing captured vessels. Weapons pass down through a warband as their previous owners are killed. And the gene seed situation is worse. Without an apothecarian and a stable supply, creating new Night Lords is a difficult and unreliable process, and every warband that loses members has fewer options for replacing them. The Legion's numbers have been declining for 100 centuries, and the decline has no floor except zero. Why they keep doing it, which raises the question this part exists to ask. Why do they persist? They have no cause. Curze's doctrine died with him, and most Night Lords have no interest in reconstructing it. They serve no god, unlike the other traitor legions. They pursue no restoration of anything, unlike Abaddon's Black Legion. They hold no territory and want none. The available answer is bleak, and it is the honest one. They persist because terror is what they know how to do, and because a warband that stops raiding stops existing, and because 10,000 years of doing one thing produces men who cannot do anything else. No outcome is being worked toward here. They are maintaining a condition, and the condition is the only life any of them has ever had. Og, Sog, what the terror became. The method survived the man, and what it became without his reasoning behind it is the darkest thing in this account. Curze had an argument. Fear deployed as policy, aimed at producing surrender, resting on the claim that nothing else alters how people behave. The argument had holes, and this series has found several, and it was an argument. His sons kept the practice and dropped the justification. A Night Lord's raid in the 41st millennium terrorizes a population because that is what Night Lords do. There is no compliance to be achieved because the warband has no interest in governing the world and will leave within days. There is no message being sent because nobody is receiving it on behalf of any authority. The atrocity is the activity. It has no function beyond itself, which means 10,000 years of men have been performing a method whose entire justification was that it served a purpose, in circumstances where it serves none, because their father taught it to them before he died, and nobody has thought of anything else. The ones who still believe. A minority within the Legion holds to something more, and they deserve a mention because they complicate the picture. Some Night Lords maintain that the Legion's original purpose was legitimate, that Curze was correct about humanity, correct about the Imperium's hypocrisy, and correct that terror honestly applied is preferable to violence, dressed up as justice. These warbands select targets accordingly. They strike at corrupt imperial officials, at governors whose populations are suffering, at institutions whose failures they consider proven. And the result is close to indistinguishable from what everybody else in the Legion does, because a population being terrorized does not experience the difference between a raid with a rationale and one without. The setting presents both kinds, and lets the reader see that the outcome is the same, which is the most efficient refutation of Curze's whole position that anybody has managed. Khan, what they cannot do, we close on the limitation that defines them, and that they will never escape. They cannot unify. Abaddon has attempted it. The Black Legion's Black Crusades have drawn in warbands from every traitor legion, and Night Lords have joined them, and the joining has never lasted. A warband takes what the crusade offers, and departs when the offer stops being worth the constraint. The reason is structural rather than temperamental. Unification requires an authority that warbands accept, and the Night Lord's entire history is of a formation that held together only under a figure who terrified it. Abaddon is formidable. He is not Konrad Curze, and the 8th Legion does not respond to anything less. So they remain what they became on Sagwalsa, a name shared by strangers, declining slowly, doing the one thing they were taught, on a schedule set by nothing except the availability of targets. 10,000 years, and the only organizing principle any of them has is a method taught by a man who despised them. How a warband is held together. Since fear of the primarch is no longer available, something else keeps a warband from dissolving, and what that something is varies from group to group. Most run on the same principle the Nostramo hives ran on. A leader holds position because the alternative is worse for everybody beneath him, and he holds it only as long as that calculation stays true. Some are held together by a shared campaign. A warband pursuing a particular vendetta against a particular chapter or world has a purpose for as long as the vendetta lasts. A few are held by something closer to loyalty, usually to a commander who has kept his men alive across centuries when other warbands were being destroyed. And all of them are subject to the same failure. A commander who loses his edge, or his ship, or a critical engagement, is replaced by whoever moves first, and the replacement is rarely peaceful, which means the Legion's leadership turns over constantly, at every level, by violence, and any long-term plan a commander forms is subject to his personal survival in a system designed to end it. The ones they fight. The Night Lord's choice of enemies has a pattern, and the pattern says something about what they have become. They avoid Space Marines where they can. That is not cowardice in the sense the word usually carries. A warband with irreplaceable equipment and no reinforcement has a rational interest in avoiding engagements that cost it veterans, and Astartes engagements cost veterans. So the targets are civilian populations, isolated garrisons, agri-worlds, mining colonies, shipping lanes, and anywhere the Imperium's protection is thin. There are exceptions, and the exceptions are the vendettas. Individual warbands carry grudges against named chapters going back millennia, and when a grudge is in play, the calculation goes out of the window. But the ordinary business of the Legion is the terrorizing of people who cannot fight back, and this is the point at which any romantic reading of Konrad Curze's argument collapses. He justified terror as a means of compliance. What his sons do is take what they need from the defenseless, and the terror is a habit they bring with them. The recruitment problem. One further consequence deserves examining, because it shapes what the Legion is turning into. They take recruits from the worlds they raid. Without Nostramo, the Night Lords have no source of aspirants, so they make new members from whatever populations they encounter: hive gangers, criminals, and above all the young and violent of worlds they have already terrorized. Consider the selection that produces. A warband raids a world, brutalizes its population, and then recruits from the people who impressed them during the process. What impresses a Night Lord is a particular set of qualities, and those qualities are not the ones Curze would have selected for. Add to that the deteriorating gene seed, the absence of proper apothecary facilities, and the lack of any training regime beyond survival within the warband. The result is a Legion drifting further from what it was with every generation of recruits, becoming steadily more like the criminal underclass it draws from, and less like a space marine formation. 10,000 years of that has produced warbands whose members would be unrecognizable to the Terran veterans of the 8th Legion. Now, how it finishes. The Legion's future is worth naming plainly, because they do not have one. They are declining. The equipment is finite. The gene seed is deteriorating. The recruits are worse. The numbers are falling, and no mechanism exists to reverse any of it. Nothing dramatic will finish them. There will be no last stand, no final battle, no imperial crusade that hunts down the last Night Lord. The Imperium has never considered them a priority target, precisely because they hold nothing and threaten nothing strategic. What will happen is arithmetic. Warbands will lose engagements. Ships will fail and not be replaced. Commanders will be killed and their formations absorbed or scattered. The name will be used by fewer and fewer groups, and then by none. And nobody will record the moment it stops, because there is no Legion left to notice. That is the ending waiting for the sons of the Primarch, who saw every ending. His own was staged, witnessed, and preserved on a pictolog. Theirs will be a slow subtraction that finishes without anybody being present for it. Sleep well. Tomorrow we look at the ones who found their way into the records. 5 nights have described a Legion that dissolved into strangers. Tonight, we look at the handful whose names survived that dissolution, because each of them represents a different answer to the question the Legion never resolved: what a Night Lord is for once the Primarch is gone. Giorgio Sahal, the Talon Master, held a position of the highest possible consequence, right up until the hour Curze died. Sahal was first captain after Sevatar, and Curze named him his heir, not in a ceremony, and not in front of the Legion, a private designation, and the object that went with it was the Corona Nox, a crown that carried the authority of succession. Then Curze was killed, and Sahal arrived to find the Primarch dead and the Corona gone. He spent the following 10,000 years looking for it. His pursuit took him across the galaxy, into a warp storm that removed him from time for most of that span, and at the last to a hive world where he built a following out of the local criminal population and hunted for the crown among people who had never heard of any of it. Consider what that story is: a legitimate heir, holding a claim nobody contests and nobody honors, searching for a symbol of authority over a Legion that stopped existing while he was looking. The Corona Nox would have made him Curze's successor. There was nothing left to succeed to. Salos Valcorin, the most documented Night Lord in the setting, is a man who spent his life in a warband he did not respect, doing work he did not believe in. Talos Valcorin was called the Soul Hunter, and what made him significant was a genetic accident. He inherited Curze's visions. Not the strategic gift, the affliction. Talos saw the future the way his primarch had, without control, without training, and without anybody to explain what he was looking at. And the parallel to a boy alone in a Nostramo hive needs no drawing out. His warband, the 10th Company under a commander called the Exalted, used him as an asset. A Night Lord's formation with a functioning seer has advantages, and the Exalted extracted them. And Talos hated what the Legion had become. He remembered the Crusade. He had served under Curze and Sevatar, and what he saw around him in the 41st millennium was warbands of degenerates performing a method they did not understand, and he said so, and it changed nothing. What Talos represents, Bredum Adivso. The reason his story matters beyond his own warband is that he is the Legion's conscience, and the Legion has no use for one. He believed the Night Lords had been something, that Curze's argument had substance, that the Terror had a purpose, and that the Legion's descent into piracy was a betrayal of what it was built for. He was right about the first two, and this account has said so across 5 nights. And he was surrounded by men who did not care. The warband wanted salvage, slaves and survival. Talos wanted the Legion to mean something, and no mechanism existed by which that want could produce any result. His visions showed him the same thing his primarchs had shown: the end, his own, his warbands, and the hour each would come. He also recovered the pict log of Curze's assassination, described on our 4th night, and made sure it was disseminated through the Legion. That was his one lasting achievement. He gave 10,000 years of Night Lords the only image of their father they would ever have, and the image was of him choosing to die. Talos's commander deserves a mention because he shows what the Legion produces when it stops resisting. The Exalted was a Night Lord who had taken enough chaos gifts to stop being recognizably one, mutated, changed, no longer the man who had entered the Eye, and commanding a warband on the strength of what he had become, rather than on any authority he had held before. Curze had contempt for the ruinous powers, as this account established on our 2nd night. The Exalted is what happens when that contempt is abandoned by a Legion with nothing else holding it in place. And he was effective. That is the uncomfortable part. The warband survived under his command, and the men in it followed him, and the doctrinal purity Talos wanted would not have kept any of them alive. Sevatar's absence. We should also account for the figure who is missing from all of this. Sevatar was described on our 3rd night. First Captain, Psyker, the only man who could speak to Curze as an equal, and the individual who held the Legion together while its primarch deteriorated. His fate is left unresolved by the setting. Taken prisoner in that Eastern campaign, and afterward the record goes quiet in a manner that has kept readers arguing for years. What matters here is the shape of his absence. Every problem this series has described about the post-Heresy Legion is a problem Sevatar was addressing while he was present. He held the warbands together. He stood between a deteriorating primarch and the men who feared him, and made each intelligible to the other. He argued with Curze when nobody else would, and his arguments occasionally landed. Remove him, and there is nobody between Konrad Curze and the men who feared him, and nobody to hold the 8th Legion together when Curze was gone. The Night Lords lost their future twice, once when their primarch arranged his death, and once earlier when the man who might have succeeded him was taken off the board. The Atramentar, after they. The Legion's elite deserve a note, because what happened to them is the whole decline in miniature. Our third night set out what they were: heavy assault veterans in Terminator plate, as good as anything the Crusade fielded. No warband can produce a suit of Terminator plate. So the Atramentar in the 41st millennium are a diminishing number of suits, maintained by cannibalizing each other, worn by whoever is left. Every suit destroyed is permanent. Every veteran killed inside one takes irreplaceable equipment with him. A formation that was once the Legion's hammer is now a resource being spent, and the men wearing that armor know the arithmetic as well as anybody. Why so few names? We close on the pattern because the shortage of individuals is itself informative. Other traitor legions have many named figures. The Black Legion has Abaddon and a court. The Emperor's children have Fulgrim and Lucius. The Thousand Sons have Ahriman and Magnus, and a long list of sorcerers. The Night Lords have a handful, and most of them are documented because a single author wrote about one warband. The reason is structural. A legion with no unifying authority produces no famous figures, because fame requires an audience that shares a frame of reference, and the Night Lord's warbands do not share anything. A Night Lord can be extraordinary within his own crew, and unknown 50 light-years away. There is no legion to know him, no records that span the warbands, and no tradition of preserving anybody's name, which means that whatever the 8th Legion has done across 10,000 years, almost none of it is attached to a person. Curze's sons inherited his method and his silence, and the silence has been more complete than anything else he left them. The warbands with names. A few of the larger formations have acquired identities of their own, and the names tell you what the Legion has become. Some are called after their commanders, which is the ordinary case, and reflects the fact that a warband is an extension of one man's authority, and rarely outlasts him. Some carry a designation inherited from the Legion's original companies, kept by groups whose connection to that heritage is a claim rather than a lineage. And some have taken names describing what they do: the raiding, the atrocities they are known for, the reputation they have built on particular worlds. None of them is large. A warband running a strike cruiser with a few dozen Astartes aboard is a substantial force by Night Lord standards, and formations of that size are a fraction of what a Legion company once was, which means that when the Imperium records an attack by the Night Lords, what struck them was usually a few dozen men in 10,000-year-old armor, and the terror those few dozen produce is doing the work that numbers used to do. The what happened to the ones who kept the faith? Individual Night Lords across the millennia have attempted to restore something, and the attempts follow a pattern. A commander concludes that the Legion should have a purpose again. He gathers warbands, articulates a version of Curze's doctrine, and tries to build a formation that operates on principle rather than appetite. It works for a period, sometimes for centuries. Then it fails, and the failure mode is always the same. The warbands that joined for advantage leave when the advantage stops. The men attracted by the discipline resent it once the campaign gets hard, and the commander discovers that a doctrine of terror cannot be enforced by persuasion, because the only instrument it endorses is the one that made the Legion ungovernable in the first place. Curze held the 8th Legion together by being more frightening than anything else available to it. Nobody since has met that standard, and the doctrine provides no alternative method. Every restoration attempt has therefore been an argument against itself, and every one of them has ended the same way. What Talos saw at the end. Fool. One more thing about the Legion's most documented figure, and it closes his story properly. His visions showed him his own death, as his primarchs had. The parallel goes further than the affliction. Talos, like Curze, knew the shape of his ending, and lived with it in front of him for years. And what he did with that knowledge is the difference between the two of them. Curze arranged his death to prove a point about the Imperium. Talos went on fighting. He did not stage anything, did not dismiss any guards, and did not treat his ending as an argument to be won. He carried the knowledge and continued, and when the moment arrived he met it in the ordinary way, in the middle of doing his work. The son handled the same affliction better than the father did. That is not a small observation, and this account will not overstate it. Talos had the advantage of knowing how Curze's version had ended, which is a resource the Primarch never had. But it does establish that the gift did not require the response Curze gave it. What nobody inherited. We close on the absence, at the center of all these figures. Sahal held a claim to a succession that had no object. Talos held a doctrine that no warband wanted. The Exalted held a warband and no doctrine at all. Sevatar held everything together and was taken off the board before the hour it mattered most. Not one of them inherited what a legion normally passes down, a structure, a purpose, and the means of continuing. Curze left his sons a method. He left no reason for it that survived him, no organization to carry it, and no successor with the standing to hold the Legion together. Every named Night Lord in the records is a man improvising in the absence of an inheritance, and the improvisations have all failed, and the failures have taken 10,000 years to accumulate into what the Legion is now. Sleep well. Tomorrow, what the argument was worth. 6 knights have described a Primarch, a Legion, and what became of both. Tonight we take the argument itself, apart, in the open, because Konrad Curze made a case for what he did, and the case is better than it has any right to be. He is the only traitor Primarch who never claimed to have been wronged, never asked for anything, and never once said he had made a mistake. That refusal is the subject. The claim. State it plainly first, in the strongest form the setting allows. Curze's position was that fear works. A population that fears punishment without limit does not commit crimes. Not fewer crimes. None. Nostramo under the Night Haunter went from a world where murder was ordinary to a world where the streets were safe, and it did so within a period measured in months rather than generations. No court did that. No police force did that. What did it was a figure in the dark who killed criminals and displayed the bodies where everyone could see them, and the population's response was to stop. Curze observed this working. He then applied the same method across the Great Crusade, and it worked there too. Worlds brought into compliance by the 8th Legion stayed compliant, and they stayed compliant at a lower cost in Imperial lives than most legions achieved. For a long stretch of the Crusade, nobody at Terra inquired further into any of it. The why it is not easily dismissed. The uncomfortable part is that the mechanism is real. Deterrence works. Every legal system that has ever existed relies on it to some degree, and the Imperium of the 41st millennium relies on it more heavily than most. Public executions, Arbeiter's brutality, and the commissariat that this channel covered in another series all run on the same principle Curze ran on. The difference between Curze and the Imperium is one of degree and of honesty rather than of kind. He was more thorough. He was also more direct about what he was doing, and he never dressed it in the language of justice or duty or the Emperor's will. He hurt people until other people stopped, and he said so. An Imperium that hangs men in public squares to discourage sedition is making the same argument with better manners, where it breaks. And now the failure, which the setting makes plain, and which Curze never accepted. Nostramo relapsed. Once he left, the world went back to what it had been. Faster, in fact, and worse. The gangs returned, the murders resumed, and inside a handful of years, the world had returned to what it was before he started, and in some respects worse than that. That is the refutation, and it is total. A deterrent that requires the deterrent to be present has not changed anything. It has suppressed behavior for as long as the suppression continues, and the moment it stops, the behavior returns, because nothing underneath it was altered. Curze produced obedience. He never produced a single person who thought differently about anything. What he did with that information. His response to the relapse is the most revealing thing about him. He did not conclude that the method had failed. He concluded that the population had failed. And then he destroyed the world, as the second night described. A single order, delivered from orbit, that ended Nostramo and everyone on it. Consider the reasoning that requires. A man tests a method, observes it working, observes it failing the moment he withdraws, and interprets the failure as a defect in the subjects rather than in the technique. That is not the reasoning of somebody making a rational argument about justice. It is the reasoning of somebody who has decided the conclusion in advance and will not permit evidence to touch it, which is where the whole edifice comes down. Curze's case for terror was never a case at all. It was a description of what he was going to do anyway, constructed afterward, in language that sounded like an argument. You, the visions. There is a second problem underneath the first, and it is the one that makes Curze tragic rather than merely monstrous. He saw the future. Our opening night established it. The visions arrived unbidden. They proved accurate, and they showed him things no mind should have to hold. And he took the wrong lesson from them. A man who sees the future and finds it fixed decides that his own conduct changes nothing. Somebody holding that belief has no reason to weigh whether his conduct is right, because rightness implies a choice, and he has decided there is no choice. Everything Curze did afterward runs on that. He was not choosing to be cruel. In his understanding, he was watching himself be cruel, in a sequence that had already been written, with no more capacity to alter it than a man watching a play he has already seen. which is the most complete abdication available. He gave up responsibility for his own conduct on philosophical grounds, and then spent 2 centuries conducting himself accordingly. Why he let the assassin kill him. The 4th night described his death and the words he spoke to Meshen, and they belong here because they are the argument's final form. He let her reach him. The vision had shown him her arrival, and he did nothing serious to prevent it. And what he told her, in substance, was that his death would prove his point. If the Emperor sent an assassin to kill a son for carrying out judgment, then the Emperor was conceding that judgment was what Curze had been doing, and killing him for it made the Emperor a hypocrite rather than a judge. That is a clever position, and it is entirely empty. An Imperium that executes a mass murderer concedes nothing about justice. It removes somebody who has become intolerable. Curze constructed a reading in which his own death vindicated him, because a man who has already decided he was never wrong will construct that reading out of whatever material arrives. He died satisfied. That is the detail that stays with people, and it should, because it is the last piece of evidence that the argument was never open to examination. What his sons inherited. We close on what the argument left behind, because the Legion took the form and lost the content. Curze had a theory. It was wrong, and it was self-serving, and he refused to test it, but it existed, and everything he did connected back to it. The Night Lords as they exist now have no theory. Our 5th night described what they became. Warbands, scattered, running raids on Imperial worlds for the terror itself, rather than toward any end. They still paint the lightning. They still display the bodies. They still do everything the Legion did under Curze. And there is no argument underneath any of it. Nobody in those warbands is making a case about deterrence, because there is nothing to deter and nobody to convince, which produces the bleakest outcome available for a Legion that once had a position. They are performing the ritual of an argument their primarch abandoned when he died, for no reason, on worlds that will never be brought into compliance, in front of populations that will never be reformed. Curze at least believed something. His sons kept the method and lost the belief, and what remains is cruelty that has stopped even pretending to be for anything. What his brothers said. 2 primarchs took Curze's position head-on, and the exchanges are worth setting out because they are the only times anybody argued with him properly. Rogel Dawn confronted him about his methods during the Crusade. Dawn's objection was that the Imperium was building something, and that a foundation of terror produces a structure that stands only while the terror does. The confrontation turned violent, and Curze nearly killed him. What he did not do was answer the point. And Vulcan, described on the 2nd night of this account, held the opposite position on every question that mattered, that a compliance achieved by butchery is worth less than one achieved by any other means, and that a people governed by fear have not been brought into anything. Nothing resembling an argument came back at Vulcan either. What came back was what he did to him afterward, which our 4th night touched on. The pattern holds across every recorded exchange. Confronted with an objection, Curze did not engage with the objection. He asserted, or he attacked, or he predicted the objector's death. A man with a genuine case answers his critics. A man performing a case does something else, and Curze did the something else every single time. The comparison he would have hated rolled. There is a legion that ran the same argument and arrived somewhere entirely different, and the comparison is unflattering. The Ultramarines brought worlds into compliance and left administrations behind that worked. Their conquests held after they left, because what they installed was a functioning system rather than a memory of what happens to people who step out of line. That is the same objective Kurds claimed: order, compliance, a population that does not need to be conquered twice. Guilliman achieved it. Curze achieved suppression for as long as he was present, and nothing afterward. Gentleness has nothing to do with the difference. Guilliman's compliances involved plenty of killing, and Ultramar's founding was not bloodless. The difference is that one of them built something people could live inside, and the other built a threat, and threats decay the moment the person making them leaves the room. Kurds had 2 centuries to notice this. His brother was doing it in the next sector. What the Legion believed at the time. One thing this account should be careful about is the assumption that the Night Lords all agreed with their primarch. They did not, and the split ran through the Legion for its entire existence. A portion of them believed the argument. These were the ones who understood themselves as enforcing something, who took the terror seriously as an instrument, and who could give an account of why the bodies were displayed where they were displayed. A portion of them enjoyed it, and required no argument at all. The Nostramo recruitment, described on our first night, filled the Legion with men from a criminal population, and a substantial number of them found the work congenial without needing a philosophy attached. And a portion objected, quietly, and kept objecting, and this is the group history has been least kind to. They existed. Several are named in the records. They served in a legion whose methods they disliked, under a primarch who could not be reasoned with, in a chain of command where dissent was fatal. What happened to them is what happens in such organizations. They fell in battle, or they were transferred, or they stopped objecting. 2. Why the argument still gets made. We close on why this matters beyond one legion, because the argument did not die with Curze. The Imperium of this era runs on his principle, not his methods, but his principle, and the distinction is thinner than the Imperium would like. Public execution as policy, the Arbeits, the Commissariat, covered at length elsewhere on this channel, standing behind a line with a pistol to make running more frightening than advancing. An entire civilization organized around the proposition that people behave when the consequences of not behaving are visible and severe. Kurds took that proposition and applied it without the restraint that makes it tolerable, and the Imperium executed him for it, and then carried on applying it. Which is the uncomfortable thing this series has been walking toward. Far from being an aberration in the setting, the Night Lords are its own logic, run past the point where anybody is willing to look at it, by a man who refused to pretend it was anything other than what it was. That refusal is the only thing about him that was honest, and it is the reason his argument almost works, and it is why the Imperium had to kill him rather than answer him. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the last night, and the question of what any of it amounted to. 7 nights ago, this account opened on a world with no sun, and a child who came down into it out of the sky. Tonight we close the ledger. Yeth. The ledger set out the events in order, without the argument attached. A boy landed alone on a world where the sun never rises, raised himself among the worst population in the Imperium, and became the thing that population feared. He cleaned it up. Nostramo went from lawless to orderly under his hand, and the improvement was real. The Emperor arrived, and a man who had spent his life doing one thing was given a legion and told to do it across the galaxy. He did. Worlds were brought into compliance and stayed compliant, and the Imperium accepted the results and did not enquire. Then Nostramo relapsed. He destroyed it from orbit, killing everyone including the population his legion recruited from. The Imperium began to object. Curze was censured, and the censure came after 2 centuries of tolerated conduct, which he read as hypocrisy, and which was hypocrisy. Horus turned, and Curze went with him, and what the 8th Legion did during the Heresy was what it had always done, at a larger scale and against Imperial targets rather than for them. The Legion came apart during the war. Curze let an assassin kill him, and what remained scattered into warbands that are still running raids 10,000 years later, without a purpose, against targets that no amount of raiding will ever change. There is the sequence entire. Nothing in it required chaos, and chaos is barely present anywhere along the way. What makes him different? Set Curze beside the other traitor primarchs, and the difference is stark. Horus wanted to rule, and was flattered into believing he should. Fulgrim wanted perfection, and was given a sword. Angron was tortured into what he became. Lorgar wanted to worship something and was told to stop. Magnus tried to help and was punished for it. Mortarion hated the warp and ended up owned by it. Every one of those is a story about somebody being changed. Nothing changed Curze. He arrived on Nostramo as what he was, did the same thing for his entire life, and died doing it. Chaos never had to work on him because there was nothing to convert. The 8th Legion's methods were in place before the Heresy and did not alter afterward. He is the only Primarch whose fall required no fall. He was already there. He's what he was owed, and now the part this account has been putting off, because the setting does not let it go. Something was done to him. A Primarch was scattered as an infant by an accident nobody has explained, and Curze landed on the worst world available. Not a feudal world with knights, not an ice world with tribes. A hive of murderers under permanent darkness, with no sun, no order, and nobody to raise him. And he came with visions. He saw his own death, and his brothers' deaths, and the futures of everyone he met, from childhood, without asking for any of it, and without anyone to explain what was happening to him. Consider what a mind does with that, at an age before it has any defenses. He concluded the future was fixed because everything he saw came true. He concluded his own conduct was written because he had watched it happen before he did it. That conclusion is wrong, and it destroyed him, and nobody on that planet was in any position to correct it. The Emperor arrived 20 years too late, and never addressed any of it. As our first night described, nobody sat down with Konrad Curze and explained what he was seeing. He was owed that. He did not get it. And what he did with the rest of his life is his own responsibility. And both of those statements are true at once. What he made of his sons. The Legion is the part where sympathy runs out entirely. Curze recruited from Nostramo. He took the population he had spent his life terrorizing and put it in power armor, and the men he elevated were criminals from a criminal world with no reason to be anything else. He then gave them a philosophy that permitted everything they already wanted to do. Our first knight described the recruitment as the decision that poisoned the Legion, and this account holds to that. Every other primarch's failures were his own. Curze's failures were replicated across 100,000 men who then went out and applied them to the galaxy, and they are still applying them. He also gave them nothing to hold on to afterward, no structure that could survive him, no doctrine that meant anything without his presence, and no successor. Last night set out where that ended. Scattered bands going through the motions of a case that stopped being argued when he died. That is what he left his sons. The method, without the man, without the meaning, forever. What the Imperium got. The other party to this deserves an accounting too, and it does not come out well. The Imperium used Curze for 2 centuries. It took the compliances, filed the results, and left the questions unasked, while the 8th Legion produced worlds that stayed conquered at a lower cost than anyone else managed. It objected when the conduct became visible enough to be embarrassing, and it never once addressed the thing underneath. Nobody investigated the visions. Nobody assessed whether a primarch who had raised himself in a hive of murderers required something other than a legion and a target list. The Imperium then sent an assassin, and Curze let her kill him, and used his own death to make the point that the Imperium had been complicit the whole time. He was right about that. It is the only part of his argument that survives examination, and the Imperium has never answered it because there is no answer. What the setting does with him. We should also say why this legion holds the attention it does, because their popularity is worth examining. The Night Lords are the traitor legion with the best fiction attached to them. Their story has been told from inside, at squad level, by writers interested in what it feels like to be an ordinary member of a doomed formation, and the result is a portrait of Chaos Space Marines as tired, bitter, poorly supplied men holding a wreck of a ship together. That perspective is rare in the setting, and it is the reason they land. They are the only faction in the galaxy who are depicted as losing, permanently, without dignity, and who keep going anyway. Our 6th night covered the individuals the records preserved, and every one of them is a study in that condition. What makes the Night Lords frightening has nothing to do with power. They frighten as a picture of what a person becomes once the thing he believed in stops being available and he carries on with the motions anyway. Good night. Under a sky that never brightened, a child came down out of the dark, and nobody came for him. He raised himself in the dark, among people who would have killed him for anything he was carrying, and he taught himself the only lesson that world had to teach, that fear stops people, and nothing else does. Then he saw the future, and what he saw was fixed, and he decided that made him a spectator to his own life. He was wrong. He had 2 centuries, and 20 brothers, and an emperor who could have told him so, and none of them did, and he died satisfied that he had been right about everything. His sons are still out there. They still paint the lightning on their armor, still come at night, still leave the bodies where the survivors will find them. They do it in places nothing will reform, before people nothing will convince, for a reason not one of them could put into words if asked. The man who gave them the reason has been dead for 10,000 years. They have not stopped. Good night, my friend.